Chapter 10. Christian Education. Swelling the Cranium. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Tertullian, 3rd century theologian. The primitive church had no New Testament, no thought-out theology, no stereotyped traditions. The men who took Christianity to the Gentile world had no special training, only a great experience, in which all maxims and philosophies were reduced to the simple task of walking in the light, since the light had come. B. H. Streeter, 20th century English theologian and biblical scholar. In the minds of most Christians, formal Christian education qualifies a person to do the Lord's work. Unless a Christian has graduated from Bible college or seminary, he or she is viewed as being a para-minister, a pseudo-Christian worker. Such a person cannot preach, teach, baptize, or administer the Lord's Supper, since he or she has not been formally trained to do such things. Right? The idea that a Christian worker must attend Bible college or seminary to be legitimate is deeply ingrained. So much so that when people feel a call of God in their lives, they are conditioned to begin hunting for a Bible college or seminary to attend. Such thinking fits poorly with the early Christian mindset. Bible colleges, seminaries, and even Sunday schools were utterly absent from the early church. All are human innovations that came hundreds of years after the apostles' death. How then were Christian workers trained in the first century if they did not go to a religious school? Unlike today's ministerial training, first-century training was hands-on rather than academic. It was a matter of apprenticeship rather than of intellectual learning. It was aimed primarily at the spirit rather than at the frontal lobe. In the first century, those called to the Lord's work were trained in two ways. 1. They learned the essential lessons of Christian ministry by living a shared life with a group of Christians. In other words, they were trained by experiencing body life as non-leaders. And 2. They learned the Lord's work under the tutelage of an older, seasoned worker. Remarking about the first-century church, Puritan John Owen writes, "Every church was then a seminary, in which provision and preparation was made." Echoing these words, R. Paul Stevens states, "The best structure for equipping every Christian is already in place. It predates the seminary and the weekend seminar, and will outlast both." In the New Testament, no other nurturing and equipping is offered than the local church. In the New Testament church, as in the ministry of Jesus, people learned in the furnace of life, in a relational living, working, and ministering context. In stark contrast, contemporary ministerial training can be described by the religious talk of Job's miserable comforters: rational, objective, and abstract. Very little is practical, experiential, or spiritual. A complete examination of the methods by which Christian workers were trained in the first century is beyond the scope of this book. However, a small chorus of books have been dedicated to the subject. In this chapter, we will trace the origin of the seminary, the Bible college, and the Sunday school. We will also trace the history of the youth pastor. And we will discuss how each of these is at odds with the way of Christ, for each is based upon the educational system of the world. 4 stages of theological education. Throughout church history, there have been 4 stages of theological education. They are Episcopal, monastic, scholastic, and seminarian, or pastoral. Let's briefly examine each one. Episcopal. Theology in the patristic age, 3rd to 5th centuries, was called Episcopal because the leading theologians of the day were bishops. This system was marked by the training of bishops and priests on how to perform the various rituals and liturgies of the church. Monastic. The monastic stage of theological education was tied to the ascetic and mystical life. It was taught by monks living in monastic communities and later cathedral schools. Monastic schools were founded in the 3rd century. These schools sent missionaries to uncharted territories after the 4th century. During this stage, the Eastern Church Fathers became steeped in Platonic thought. They held to the misguided view that Plato and Aristotle were schoolmasters whose techniques could be used to bring men to Christ. Though they did not intend to lead people astray, their heavy reliance on these pagan philosophers severely diluted the Christian faith. Since many of the Church Fathers were pagan philosophers and orators prior to their conversions, the Christian faith soon began to take on a philosophical bent. Justin Martyr, 100 to 165, one of the most influential Christian teachers of the 2nd century, dressed in the garb of a philosopher. Justin believed that philosophy was God's revelation to the Greeks. He claimed that Socrates, Plato, and others had the same standing for the Gentiles as Moses had for the Jews. After AD 200, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the Christian world, as it had been for the Greeks. A special school was formed there in AD 180. This school was the equivalent of a theological college. In Alexandria, the institutional study of Christian doctrine began. Origen, 185 to 254, one of the school's early and most influential teachers, was deeply influenced by pagan philosophy. He was a colleague of Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, and drew much from his teaching. According to Neoplatonic thought, an individual must descend through different stages of purification in order to attain to oneness with God. Origen was the first to organize key theological concepts into systematic theology. Of this period, Will Durant has observed, "The gap between philosophy and religion was closing, and reason, for 1,000 years, consented to be the handmaiden of theology." Edwin Hatch echoes these thoughts, saying, "Within a century and a half after Christianity and philosophy first came into closest contact, the ideas and methods of philosophy had flowed in such mass into Christianity and filled so large a place in it, as to have made it no less a philosophy than a religion." After Origen's death, Christian schools disappeared. Theological education reverted back to the Episcopal form. Bishops were trained by personal contact with other bishops. The sum and substance of clerical learning at this time was the study of Gregory the Great's pastoral theology. Gregory taught bishops how to be good pastors. By the mid-8th century, bishops' schools were founded. In the 10th century, cathedrals began sponsoring their own schools. Scholastic. The third stage of theological education owes much to the culture of the university. By 1200, a number of cathedral schools had evolved into universities. The University of Bologna in Italy was the first university to appear. The University of Paris came in a close second, followed by Oxford. The University of Paris became the philosophical and theological center of the world at that time. It would later become the seat of the Protestant Seminary. Higher education was the domain of the clergy, and the scholar was viewed as the guardian of ancient wisdom. The present-day university grew from the bishop's responsibility to provide clerical training. Theology was regarded as the queen of sciences in the university. From the mid-12th century to the end of the 14th century, 71 universities were established in Europe. Contemporary theology cut its teeth on the abstractions of Greek philosophy. University academics adopted an Aristotelian model of thinking that centered on rational knowledge and logic. The dominating drive in scholastic theology was the assimilation and communication of knowledge. For this reason, the Western mind has always been fond of creedal formulations, doctrinal statements, and other bloodless abstractions. One of the most influential professors in the shaping of contemporary theology is Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142. Abelard is partly responsible for giving us modern theology. His teachings set the table and prepared the menu for scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. Distinguished by Abelard, the School of Paris emerged as the model for all universities to follow. Abelard applied Aristotelian logic to revealed truth, though even he understood the tension between the two. I do not wish to be a philosopher, if that means I contradict St. Paul. I do not wish to be a disciple of Aristotle, if that means I separate myself from Christ. He also gave the word theology the meaning it has today. Before him, this word was only used to describe pagan beliefs. Taking his cue from Aristotle, Abelard mastered the pagan philosophical art of dialectic, the logical disputation of truth. He applied this art to the Scriptures. Christian theological education never recovered from Abelard's influence. Athens is still in its bloodstream. Aristotle, Abelard, and Aquinas all believed that reason was the gateway to divine truth. So from its beginnings, Western university education involved the fusion of pagan and Christian elements. Martin Luther had it right when he said, "What else are the universities than places for training youth in Greek glory?" Although Luther was a university man himself, his critique was aimed at the practice of teaching Aristotelian logic at the university level. Seminarian. Seminary theology grew out of the scholastic theology that was taught in the universities. As we have seen, this theology was based on Aristotle's philosophical system. Seminary theology was dedicated to the training of professional ministers. Its goal was to produce seminary-trained religious specialists. It taught the theology, not of the early bishop, monk, or professor, but of the professionally qualified minister. This is the theology that prevails in the contemporary seminary. One of the greatest theologians of this century, Karl Barth, reacted against the idea that theological education should be relegated to an elite class of professional orators. He wrote, "Theology is not a private reserve of theologians. It is not a private affair of professors, nor is it a private affair of pastors. Theology is a matter for the Church. The term laity is one of the worst in the vocabulary of religion and ought to be banished from Christian conversation." Concerning the seminary, we might say that Peter Abelard laid the egg and Thomas Aquinas hatched it. Aquinas had the greatest influence on contemporary theological training. In 1879, his work was endorsed by a papal bull as an authentic expression of doctrine to be studied by all students of theology. Aquinas' main thesis was that God is known through human reason. He preferred the intellect to the heart as the organ for arriving at truth. Thus, the more highly trained people's reason and intellect, the better they will know God. Aquinas borrowed this idea from Aristotle, and that is the underlying assumption of many, if not most, contemporary seminaries. The teaching of the New Testament is that God is spirit, and as such, he is known by revelation, spiritual insight, to one's human spirit. Reason and intellect can cause us to know about God and help us to communicate what we know, but they fall short in giving us spiritual revelation. The intellect is not the gateway for knowing the Lord deeply, neither are the emotions. In the words of A.W. Tozer, "Divine truth is of the nature of spirit, and for that reason can be received only by spiritual revelation. God's thoughts belong to the world of spirit, man's to the world of intellect, and while spirit can embrace intellect, the human intellect can never comprehend spirit. Man by reason cannot know God. He can only know about God. Man's reason is a fine instrument, and useful within its field. It was not given as an organ by which to know God." In short, extensive Bible knowledge, a high-powered intellect, and razor-sharp reasoning skills do not automatically produce spiritual men and women who know Jesus Christ profoundly and who can impart a life-giving revelation of Him to others. This, by the way, is the basis of spiritual ministry. As Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662, once put it, "It is the heart which perceives God, and not the reason." Today, Protestants and Catholics alike draw upon Aquinas' work, using his outline for their theological studies. Aquinas' crowning work, Summa Theologica, the sum of all theology, is the model used in virtually all theological classes today, whether Protestant or Catholic. Consider the order in which Aquinas' theology is laid out: God, Trinity, creation, angels, man, the divine government, such as salvation, etc., and finally, the last end. Now compare this outline to a typical systematic theology textbook used in Protestant seminaries. God, unity and Trinity, creation, angelology, the origin and character of man, soteriology, for example, salvation, etc., and finally, eschatology, the final state. Without a doubt, Aquinas is the father of contemporary theology. His influence spread to the Protestant seminaries, to the Protestant scholastics. The tragedy is, Aquinas relied so completely on Aristotle's method of logic chopping when he expounded on Holy Writ. In the words of Will Durant, the power of the Church was still adequate to secure, through Thomas Aquinas and others, the transmogrification, transformation, of Aristotle into a medieval theologian. In another book, Durant says that he began a long series of works presenting Aristotle's philosophy in Christian dress. Aquinas also quotes from another pagan philosopher profusely throughout his Summa Theologica. Regardless of how much we wish to deny it, contemporary theology is a blending of Christian thought and pagan philosophy. So we have 4 stages of theological education: Episcopal, the theology of the bishops; monastic, the theology of the monks; scholastic, the theology of the professor; and seminarian, the theology of the professional minister. Each stage of Christian education is, and always has been, highly intellectual and study-driven. As one scholar put it, whether a school was monastic, episcopal, or presbyterial, it never separated teaching from religious education, from instruction in church dogma and morals. Christianity was an intellectual religion. As products of the Reformation, we are taught to be rationalistic and very theoretical in our approach to the Christian faith. The first seminaries. For much of the medieval age, clerical education was minimal. At the time of the Reformation, many Protestant pastors who converted from Roman Catholicism had no experience in preaching. They lacked both training and education. As the Reformation progressed, however, provisions were made for uneducated pastors to attend schools and universities. Protestant ministers were not trained in oratory. They were instead trained in exegesis and biblical theology. It was assumed that if they knew theology, they could preach. This assumption accounted for the long sermons in the 16th century, which often lasted 2 or 3 hours. This type of theological training produced a new profession, the theologically trained pastor. Educated pastors now wielded tremendous influence, holding doctor's degrees in theology or other academic titles that gave them prestige. By the mid-16th century, most Protestant ministers were universally trained in some way. So, from its inception, Protestantism promoted a well-educated clergy, which became the backbone of the movement. Throughout Protestant lands, the clergy were the best educated citizens, and they used their education to wield their authority. While Protestant ministers were sharpening their theological savvy, About one-fourth of the Catholic clergy had no university training. The Catholic Church reacted to this at the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. In order for the Church to fight the new Protestant Reformation, it had to better educate its clergy. The solution? The founding of the very first seminaries. The Catholics wanted the learning and devotion of their priests to match that of the Protestant pastors. Therefore, the Council of Trent required that all cathedral and greater churches maintain to educate religiously and to train in ecclesiastical discipline a certain number of youths of the city and diocese. So we may credit the founding of the seminary to the Catholics in the late 16th century. The origin of the first Protestant seminary is clouded in obscurity, but the best evidence indicates that the Protestants copied the Catholic model and established their first seminary in America. It was established in Andover, Massachusetts, in 1808. Christian education in the United States was just as Aristotelian and highly systematized as it was in Europe. By 1860, there were 60 Protestant seminaries on American soil. This fast-paced growth was largely the result of the influx of converts produced during the Second Great Awakening, from 1800 to 1835, and the perceived need to train ministers to care for them. Before Andover Seminary was founded, the Protestants had Yale, 1701, and Harvard, 1636, to train their clergy. Ordination was granted upon completing a formal examination by graduation. But in time, these universities rejected Orthodox Christian beliefs. Harvard, for example, adopted Unitarianism. The Protestants no longer trusted an undergraduate education at Yale and Harvard, so they established their own seminaries to do the job themselves. Bible College. The Bible College is essentially a 19th century North American evangelical invention. A Bible college is a cross between a Bible Institute, training center, and a Christian liberal arts school. Its students concentrate on religious studies and are trained for Christian service. The founders of the first Bible colleges were influenced by London pastors H. G. Guinness, 1835 to 1910, and Charles Spurgeon, 1834 to 1892. In response to the revivalism of D. L. Moody, the Bible college movement blossomed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The first two Bible colleges were the Missionary Training Institute, Nyack College, New York, in 1882, and Moody Bible Institute, Chicago, in 1886. Their focus was to train ordinary laypeople to become full-time Christian workers. What led to the founding of the Bible College? From the mid-19th century, little attention had been given to traditional Christian values as an integral part of higher education. Liberal theology had begun to dominate state universities across America. In the face of these elements, the demand for missionaries, parachurch leaders, and ministers provoked the creation of the Bible College to equip the called with a Bible education. Today, there are over 400 Bible schools and colleges in the United States and Canada. Sunday School. The Sunday School is also a relatively recent invention, born some 1,700 years after Christ. A newspaper publisher named Robert Raikes, 1736 to 1811, from Britain, is credited with being its founder. In 1780, Raikes established a school in Scout Alley, Gloucester, for poor children. Raikes did not begin the Sunday school for the purpose of religious instruction. Instead, he founded it to teach poor children the basics of education. Raikes was concerned with the low level of literacy and morality among common children. Many of the children who attended his school were the victims of social and employer abuse. Because the children could not read, it was easy for others to take advantage of them. Although Raikes was an Anglican layman, the Sunday school took off like wildfire, spreading to Baptist, Congregational, and Methodist churches throughout England. The Sunday school movement came to a peak when it hit the United States. The first American Sunday school began in Virginia in 1785. Then, in 1790, a group of Philadelphians formed the Sunday School Society. Its purpose was to provide education to indigent children to keep them off the streets on Sunday. In the 18th and 19th centuries, many Sunday schools operated separately from churches. The reason? Pastors felt that laymen could not teach the Bible. In the mid-1800s, Sunday schools spread far and wide throughout America. In 1810, the Sunday school began to shift from being a philanthropic effort to help poor children to an evangelical mechanism. D.L. Moody is credited with popularizing the Sunday school in America. Under Moody's influence, the Sunday school became the primary recruiting ground for the contemporary church. Today, the Sunday school is used both to recruit new converts and to train young children in the doctrines of the faith. Public education has taken over the role for which Sunday school was designed. It should be noted that the 19th century was an era of institution building in America. Corporations, hospitals, asylums, prisons, as well as children's establishments like orphanages, reform schools, and free public schools were formed during this time. The Sunday school was just another such institution. Today, it is a permanent fixture in the traditional church. As a whole, we don't view the contemporary Sunday school as an effective institution. According to some studies, Sunday school attendance has been on the decline over the last 2 decades. Describing the way of the early church, one scholar says, "There is no evidence to suggest that teachers divided groups on the basis of age and sex. The responsibility of the child's early education, and, in particular, religious education, lay with the parents. No special arrangements seem to have been made for children by the early church. The Christian school was a long way off, around A.D. 372, and Sunday school even more so." The youth pastor. The youth pastor began appearing in churches long after Sunday schools, largely because society did not recognize or cater to the needs of this age group until the 20th century. In 1905, G. Stanley Hall popularized the concept of the adolescent as distinct from the young adult and the older child. Then, in the 1940s, the term teenager was born, and for the first time a distinct youth subculture was created. People ages 13 to 19 were no longer simply youths, they were now teenagers. After World War II, Americans developed great concern for the young people of our nation. This concern spilled over into the Christian church. Youth rallies in the 1930s, laboring under the banner Youth for Christ, spawned a parachurch organization by the same name around 1945. With new understanding and concern for the teenagers, the idea that someone needed to be employed to work with them emerged. Thus was born the professional youth minister. The youth pastor began working in large urban churches in the 1930s and 1940s. Calvary Baptist Church in Manhattan had one of the very first youth pastors. Moody Monthly magazine wrote about him in the late 1930s. The majority of youth ministers in this era, however, worked for the emerging parachurch organizations that filled the Christian landscape. By the early 1950s, thousands of professional youth ministers were meeting the spiritual needs of young people, who now had their own music, dress, literature, language, and etiquette. During this time, the Christian church began to segregate teenagers from everyone else. From the mid-1950s to the end of the 1960s, the youth pastor became an established part of evangelical churches. The position took off a bit more slowly in the mainline denominations. By the end of the 1980s, youth ministries' shift from the parachurch organizations to institutional churches was pretty well complete. Today, youth pastors are part of the professional clergy. Their position is built on the contemporary church's misguided choice to honor a division that was born in secular culture less than a century ago, namely, the division between teenagers and everyone else. Put another way, the youth pastor did not exist until a separate demographic group called teenagers emerged. In so doing, we created a problem that never before existed: what to do for and with the young people. It is not at all unlike the problem we created when a new class of Christian, the layman, was invented. The question, how do we equip the laity, was never asked before the institutional church made them a separate class of Christian. Exposing the heart of the problem. The Greek philosophers, Plato and Socrates, taught that knowledge is virtue. Good depends on the extent of one's knowledge. Hence, the teaching of knowledge is the teaching of virtue. Herein lies the root and stem of contemporary Christian education. It is built on the Platonic idea that knowledge is the equivalent of moral character. Therein lies the great flaw. Plato and Aristotle, both disciples of Socrates, are the fathers of contemporary Christian education. To use a biblical metaphor, present-day Christian education, whether it be seminarian or Bible college, is serving food from the wrong tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, rather than the tree of life. Contemporary theological learning is essentially cerebral. It can be called liquid pedagogy. We pry open people's heads, pour in a cup or two of information, and close them up again. They have the information, so we mistakenly conclude the job is complete. Contemporary theological teaching is a data transfer education. It moves from notebook to notebook. In the process, our theology rarely gets below the neck. If a student accurately parrots the ideas of his professor, he is awarded a degree. And that means a lot in a day when many Christians obsess over, and sometimes deify, theological degrees in their analysis of who is qualified to minister. Theological knowledge, however, does not prepare a person for ministry. This does not mean that the knowledge of the world, church history, theology, philosophy, and the Scriptures is without value. Such knowledge can be very useful, but it is not central. Theological competence and a high-voltage intellect alone do not qualify a person to serve in God's house. The fallacy is that men and women who have matriculated from seminary or Bible college are instantly viewed as qualified. Those who have not are viewed as unqualified. By this standard, many of the Lord's choicest vessels would have failed the test. In addition, formal theological training does not equip students for many of the challenges of ministry. According to the Faith Communities Today study, or FACT, released by Hartford Seminary in Connecticut, seminary graduates and clergymen who had advanced degrees scored lower in both their ability to deal with conflict and in demonstrating a clear sense of purpose than did the non-seminary graduates. The survey showed that clergy with no ministerial education or formal certificate program scored the highest on tests that revealed how well one deals with conflict and stress. Bible college graduates scored slightly lower. Seminary graduates scored the lowest. The major finding of the study was that congregations with leaders who have a seminary education are, as a group, far more likely to report that in their congregations they perceive less clarity of purpose, more and different kinds of conflict, less person-to-person communication, less confidence in the future, and more threat from changes in worship. All of this indicates that a person who matriculates from the theory-laden seminary or Bible college has been given little to no hands-on experience in the crucible of body life. By body life, we are not referring to the common experience of being in an institutional church setting. We are referring to the rough-and-tumble, messy, raw, highly taxing experience of the body of Christ, where Christians live as a close-knit community and struggle to make corporate decisions together under Christ's headship, without a stated leader over them. In this regard, the seminary is spiritually stultifying on some pretty basic levels. The approach taken by seminaries is also self-referential. It sets its own criteria for who should minister and on what terms. It then often judges those who do not think the criteria are particularly useful or important. But perhaps the most damaging problem of the seminary and Bible college is that they perpetuate the humanly devised system in which the clergy live, breathe, and have their being. That system, along with every other outmoded human tradition addressed in this book, is protected, kept alive, and spread through our ministerial schools. Instead of offering the cure to the ills of the Church, our theological schools worsen them by assuming, and even defending, all of the unscriptural practices that produce them. The words of one pastor sum up the problem nicely. I came through the whole system with the best education that evangelicalism had to offer, yet I really didn't receive the training that I needed. 7 years of higher education in top-rated evangelical schools didn't prepare me to, 1, do ministry, and 2, be a leader. I began to analyze why I could preach a great sermon, and people afterwards would shake my hand and say, "Great sermon, Pastor." But these were the very people who were struggling with self-esteem, beating their spouses, struggling as workaholics, succumbing to their addictions. Their lives weren't changing. I had to ask myself why this great knowledge I was presenting didn't move from their heads to their hearts and their lives. And I began to realize that the breakdown in the church was actually based on what we learned in seminary. We were taught that if you just give people information, that's enough.